Welcome to our chapter's joint webinar with RIBA Hong Kong, Climate Action in Asia. We have just over a decade to address the global climate crisis, or we risk catastrophic damage to the natural world. As built environment professionals, we have the agency to address this climate crisis with our conscious actions. Today's session is a collaboration between the RIBA Hong Kong and Singapore chapters, bringing together professionals and experts across the innovative value chain in the built environment to present unique insights to how we can collectively and through our actions address the ongoing climate crisis. Today we have speakers Andrew Grant in the UK, Hann in Singapore, and Stefano Tranchi in Hong Kong, all of whom are active in strategizing and designing buildings and places across Asia. You can expect a lively discussion after the presentation, so please post your questions in the Q&A. I'm joined as co-moderator by Dennis Ho, Chartered Architect and East Asia Design and Urban Innovation Lead for Arup. Over to you, Dennis, to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Fiona, and hello, everyone. Our first speaker is Andrew Grant, founder and director of Grant Associates, UK and Singapore. Andrew is a landscape architect whose work explores the connection between people and nature. In 2012, he was awarded the title of Royal Society of Arts, Royal Designer for Industry in recognition of his pioneering global work, such as the multi-award winning Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. He's a visiting professor at the University of Sheffield, an honorary fellow of the RIBA, and a member of the National Infrastructure Commission Design Group. Based in the city of Bath, he's chair of the Bathscape Landscape Partnership, a member of the Bath World Heritage Site Advisory Board, and co-founder of the pop-up festival Forest of Imagination. Welcome, Andrew, to the RIBA Hong Kong and Singapore's Climate Action Series. And now over to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. So I'm a landscape architect, and I've been working in Asia, Singapore in particular, for many years. And one of the things that has struck me about this whole discussion about climate, biodiversity, and how do we as building design professionals respond to it is trying to think, what is the right question to be asking? What is it that we're actually trying to do? And it seems to me that the one common thing that we all need to be thinking about is, how do we reconnect with the natural world? How do we reconnect our design thinking, our design processes, our construction processes that are compatible with sustaining nature? And for us to design like we are part of nature, because far too much, I think, of our sort of recent sort of approach is that we are separate somehow. Humans are not part of that sort of natural environment. And what's interesting, I think, is the fact that, you know, over the last few years, the dialogue, the sort of discussion, the description, shall we say, of what we can do, how can we respond to this, what's the challenge, what are the questions, has generated just such an enormous confusion of strategizing and terminology, and, you know, different approaches by different parts of the sector. So how do we simplify that back down to something that we can actually all join in and sort of really sort of get behind? And this is why I think just sort of coming back to that reference point of designing like we're part of nature is the starting point for me. And actually, we're all creative people in this world of architecture, landscape engineering, and all the associated professions. So how do we combine our creativity, our imagination with our understanding of nature to create sustainable cities, resilient cities of the future? Another fascinating thing from my perspective is basically the split of professions involved with the built environment. Now, this is a sort of a profile of the different, you know, very quick summary of professionals in the UK, just identifying the relative numbers of engineers versus architects versus planners versus landscape architects. Every one of those is, you know, probably many years experience. Mainly the training of those individuals occurred many years before any of this conversation about how to respond to climate, etc., came about. And I see that as a real challenge as to how do we retune all of these people to think differently. And from my perspective, well, landscape architecture, I think, should be a much stronger profile in this whole discussion. We're starting at a very small base in terms of numbers. In the UK, certainly less than 1% of construction professionals. So we have to be super sort of influential, so to speak, and we have to have a voice in any of these discussions that are going on. And certainly in the UK, and it's actually obviously in Hong Kong and Singapore, the landscape architect, the Architects Declare, the Built Environments Declare program has been really quite important for us, I think. We established the UK Landscape Architects Declare Climate and Biodiversity Emergency manifesto, and managed to sort of get probably about a third of the practices in the UK signed up to that. And through this sort of mechanism, we've sort of become part of a bigger story, a bigger sort of discussion group about how do we collectively respond to these challenges through the built environment sort of group. And in a similar way, as part of the National Infrastructure Commission, the idea that actually a group of cross-disciplinary professionals have come together as part of the design group to create the infrastructure design principles. And just going back to that point about complexity, we felt it's really important to sort of boil this down to 4 key principles that every project should address. Principally climate, thinking about how an infrastructure project can respond to the climate challenge. People, obviously creating infrastructure that supports, fantastic environment for people. Places, thinking not just about place making, but actually also the natural environment and what we need to protect and enhance. And then value, which is less about how much does it cost and more about how does it add value to people's lives and have a sustainable, resilient future. So all of this is basically creating a sort of a dialogue and a conversation within professions, which is probably not just about the conventional design process of architecture of buildings, landscapes and places. There's a wider conversation that we're all part of now. And I think in terms of our work in Asia, what's interesting as well is the typologies and the types of landscapes and projects are going into realms which are definitely not just about urban design and streetscapes and making parks and gardens and podium landscapes. These are some of the big areas that we're involved with at the moment, thinking about coastal protection, management of water in a sort of environments where rainfall is decreasing or increasing, thinking about food production as a major part of urban planning, thinking about what's the optimum use of urban space in tight places like Singapore, what's the implication of regulations on how we design, whether it's actually about carbon or whether it's about the use of space or whether it's about greening, all of these things. And last but not least, I think the role of professions in the areas. I mean, the traditional hierarchy and structure of design teams, is it the right way to address the future? And certainly from my perspective, I'm pretty sure that landscape should be more advanced in that. So just reflection on the last few years, I guess. I mean, Gardens by the Bay, remarkable that it's actually 10 years since it opened this year, just this month actually. So here's a photo that was taken early on in 2012, and then just a couple of weeks ago actually, seeing how it sort of looks today. And clearly, Gardens by the Bay for us was a fantastic story about how do we create a sort of an urban ecosystem, how do we bring nature into the city, and how that has basically influenced other people. It's obviously been profiled in many interesting ways. And hopefully it will continue to influence people and grow and become more biodiverse and more interesting. Similarly, in Singapore, a few years ago, we worked on the Sentosa Brani master plan, where as landscape architects, we led the project looking at how do we replan the 600 hectares of prime sort of Singapore estate, the old port area, and Sentosa, the main leisure environment. And lots of sort of themes about greening and urban, sort of coastal protection, all the sort of environmental stories that we're talking about was brought to bear on that. And it was great to see how the team came together, with Arabson, the engineering playing a particularly important part, working with ecologists, working with economists, working with people who are specialists in the various aspects of the economy of the project. But I mean, ultimately, it made us respond to some of these big environmental challenges in terms of how does these sensitive areas respond to sea level rise predicted over the next 50, 100 years. How do we retune the perimeters of these extraordinary places to be more resilient to those sort of changes? How do we recapture and restore coral reefs, seagrass, birds, beaches, all these sort of aspects that are so common to challenges around Asia? Another one which is very topical in Singapore is the idea of how do we optimize the use of Singapore for food production, with the challenge to get 30% of the food within Singapore produced in Singapore by 2030. And this is a study that we were doing for the Lam Chung Kang master plan area, where the idea is to develop a whole sector of Singapore which is much more about food. And it makes you think differently about the systems. I mean, understanding the systems that we're involved with, the relationships, the cycle economy, all those sort of aspects that are sort of slightly abstract terms really come into focus when you start to have to think about these new challenges, these new land use planning challenges, these new sort of economic challenges. How does that work with the built environment and what we do? At a smaller level in Singapore, again, sort of rooftop sort of farm on Funan Mall, which is a great little example of a little micro system that sort of sat right in the heart of Singapore, right in the heart, the busiest part of the city. And as designers, we can be influential too in different ways. I mean, this was a garden we did at Chelsea Flower Show in 2020, which represented the sort of the ecologies of Guangzhou, a small garden, 20 meters by 10 meters, representing the sort of environmental systems that the Guangzhou government are trying to implement, the water networks, the lungs, and with the trees, and the kidneys with the water systems, and how we can sort of showcase that to a very large number of people. I mean, Chelsea Flower Show influenced and was seen by millions and millions of people, whether live or through broadcast. So we can influence people in different ways. And just finishing off, really, this is a current project of ours in London, where we were asked to transform the moat which surrounds the Tower of London. Traditionally, basically a mown grass area, 1.5 hectares in area, so completely devoid of wildlife, completely devoid of any sort of seasonal diversity. And working with Nigel Dunnett at Sheffield University, it's been transformed into this incredible display of flowers which will run through the summer and will become the sort of foundations for the moat to become effectively a nature reserve into the future. So biodiversity brought right into the heart of the city, hopefully incredibly influential, and creating a much more intimate relationship between people and biodiversity, which I think is a fundamental part of any approach to climate and built development going forward. So I think I'm going to close at that. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andrew. It's really interesting that you played into some of the themes from last week. Dr. Hussain in particular was talking about how we have to consider ourselves as part of the great scheme of nature and not treat nature as a resort. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions at the end. I'll now introduce our second speaker. Tan Hann is an architect and chair of sustainability for the Singapore Institute of Architects. Hann is a strategist and thought leader in sustainability. He both chairs the Sustainability Committee at the SIA and leads sustainable development at a global hospitality and entertainment chain. Hann is also an appointed World City Summit Young Leader, a Building and Construction Authority Built Environment Young Leader, and was the 2015 to 16 BCA Singapore Green Building Council Young Green Architect of the Year. In 2021, he founded IXSA, Innovation by Sustainability Alliance, a global non-profit think tank. His portfolio includes the award-winning Park Royal on Pickering with Woha, BCA Skylab with Savannah Jurong. He's spoken in numerous conferences, including Switch, the UN Asia Pacific Urban Forum, and COP25 Madrid, and now joins us for the RIBA Climate Action webinar. Over to you, Hann.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Fiona. At some point in my career, Fiona was my boss, and I enjoyed those times working with Fiona. It's amazing thought leader as well as a designer, of course. I'll be sharing today on the 7 environmental design guidelines. These are 7 guidelines that have been appropriated from the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that's been set up by the United Nations way back, I believe it was about 5 to 6 years ago now. And these are the 7 guidelines which we as architects and as curators and owners of the built environment can actually have a mode of agency over. I'll just go next slide, yeah, with each slide that passes. Right, so these are the 7 icons, and these have become the 7 environmental design guidelines. They also become part of the SIA design competition guidelines, as well as some of the awards that we basically endow upon our members as well. So this has become part of the judging criteria, I would say. Next slide. All right, so I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I've just learned today that I think Boris Johnson has stepped down, right? I'm not sure if that's good or bad news, but here's some other points that might make you sit up and take a bit of notice, right? So global temperatures will rise by about 4 degrees from 1900 levels in the year 2100. So there's an active move towards reducing that to about 2 degrees or less, right? Minus, or rather 1.5 degrees. And we're nowhere near actually achieving that. By 2025, 2 out of 3 people have no access to clean water. That's 2/3 of us. Over 80% of the world's fisheries are fully exploited. There's a whole refuse chunk of plastic dumped into the ocean every minute, and so on and so forth, right? And the last point, concrete is the most destructive construction material on Earth. That sounds a bit controversial, but indeed, concrete has a very high embodied carbon component. Next slide. All right, so these 17 goals are not unfamiliar to us, although we've seen them very often. We'd be hard pressed to sort of recite these goals. And to be honest, I think there's many goals within that architects do not have the agency to influence or to control. So for instance, gender equality, I mean, we might have more balanced workspaces and so on, but the truth is we're not going to do too much yet, you know, in terms of solving, say, the hunger issue or the gender issue, or maybe even good jobs and economic growth, right? Because we are, after all, guardians of the built environment. Next slide. As a result, these 7 slides come about as a bit of a response towards these SDGs, in that we're sort of limiting, but at the same time focusing our energies on what we can actually control in the whole sort of move against climate change or to mitigate climate change. Right, so it's education and integration, climate action, natural capital, resource management, and so on and so forth. We'll start off with the first, and that's education and integration. And we look at modes of actually writing project briefs, for instance, writing project guides before the project even begins, and basically talking to the developer to set some of these sustainability goals. This could include I'd say forced or coerced modes of integration, and that includes BIM integrated models, for instance, that becomes part of the deliverable requirements for the project. Likewise with collaborative appointments, where you get early contractor involvement, which is something that the industry here is trying to push for. So as you're designing the building, there's a contractor breathing over your shoulder and going, hey, you know, this can or cannot be built, or this is going to have a high sort of impact, you know, in terms of disruption towards the environment. Next slide. And these points are basically encapsulated in the SIA Green Book, which is available for a free download if you're interested. So basically, it's a guideline that looks at what some of these sustainability practices would be, and also a spectrum of the work that abides by some of these EDGs along the way. Next slide. All right, so EDG number 2, be climate action. So here's where we really look at the mathematics of how we can operate in a low carbon type of mode and measure that according to metric tons of carbon, according to operational carbon, and according to effective life cycle assessment. And here's where I'll take a leaf from the RIBA toolkit on embodied carbon. That becomes a really good guide, I would say, on your choices of material, for instance, and your choices of what the life cycles of the building materials that you're using could be, including what their end of life cycle could actually be as well. And of course, with the materials and with the operations of the materials and the operations of the equipment, we could also look at the ozone depletion potential, the global warming potential, and other indicators of what we're actually doing, with regards to climate action. Next slide. So how do we set forth some of these goals? And that could be in the example of a master planning type of project, indicating the required water savings, indicating the required environmental impact assessments, and limiting the damage to the existing ecosystems. Next slide. And when we're actually talking about designing the building forms, they would of course need to maintain certain aspect ratios. They would need to, incorporate as many renewables and clean energy tools as you possibly can. And these could be also sort of targeting towards a preset energy requirement or an energy savings requirement that you set for a particular precinct. Next slide. Here as well, an example of a project in Bangalore in India, which actually has a cooler temperature than most of the rest of India. So taking or making use of the ambient temperature of about 23 to 24 degrees Celsius on a good day, and using that to cool the data center as opposed to using, electrical cooling. Next slide, please. The next EDG would be on natural capital. So basically, that's preserving as much nature as possible. Andrew's covered pretty much all of that already, but effectively, the metrics could include biodiversity indices, depending on where you are and which types of biodiversity are specific to your climates and your context. A green plot ratio, or GNPR, which looks at how much green you're actually replacing in terms of how do you carry that green which you've replaced and put it, for example, in vertical greens. The measurables could include leaf area index, for instance, as well as landscape replacement, and how many species of biodiversity have been reintroduced as a result of the building. Next slide, please. So very quickly, somewhat overexposed building in the sense of its coverage. Basically, the idea was to replace 100% of what was green, and this was more than 10 years ago now, at around the same time as Gardens by the Bay was actually designed. So we're going through a bit of zeitgeist at that point in time in sort of repurposing buildings as green interfaces as well. Next slide. Resource management. I'll spend a bit more time on this because there's an increasing shift now towards the discussion of embodied carbon and what we're going to do with waste material. So some of the metrics could include, for example, a percentage replacement of energy, for instance, of renewable energy, as well as of materials that have previously been recycled or are recyclable downstream at the end of their life cycle. So next slide, please. So there's an example of a project that makes use of recycled materials, although it looks fairly sort of constructed out of virgin material. This is a project that makes use of 1.5 million water bottles that has had its PET recycled into building blocks. Next slide. These blocks constitute the facade bricks as well as the interior lighting bricks. Right? And you can see how they interlock in one of the images. Next slide. So each of these bricks, they're about the size of a small jerry can, and basically they can interlock and tessellate, therefore trapping air for insulation. And where you find that there are any leaks or any potential areas of leakage, you could also sort of seal that up with resin. Next slide. Here, a further example that makes use of recycled cigarette butts and cigarette filters, and therefore becoming little conduits for either electrical wiring, but also as air filters given enough volume. Next slide. So they're basically molded into these forms that again connect and tessellate, in this case for a temporary exhibition pavilion in the middle of a courtyard in the middle of Italy. And it's self-standing in a way that is also beneficial because you don't need to do any bolting to the existing infrastructure, and its weight also would be self-supporting. And the other aspects or the other parts of the cigarette then become a compressed cardboard and compressed paper for furniture. That's pretty straightforward. Next slide. Adapting some of that locally as well. So you see furniture that's also made out of threaded recycled PET, as well as the chair that you see in the foreground. That's basically made out of recycled coconut husks with polycarbonate, which is sourced from a lot of compact disc, remember those things, or you know, DVD type of jewel cases that were melted down and then reconstituted into different materials. The material on the right-hand side, basically that's acoustic material that's again woven from recycled PET threads, therefore enhancing the acoustic performance in this case of a phone booth within an office type of environment. Next slide, please. Yeah, in this case, I'd like to draw attention to the image in the middle. That's basically a decommissioned solar panel that now finds a second life as a boardroom table, you know, and it's well gridded, so you can play tic-tac-toe with the person next to you. The bricks on the right-hand side, they're fashioned in a similar way to the earlier bricks from the water bottles. In this case, this was again made out of recycled polycarbonate that's been sort of reinforced with agricultural waste, and that lends itself the brownish type of color as well as its translucency. And these bricks are what you can basically sort of interlock and create an entire room full of recycled materials. Next slide. Getting to the end now, so urban harmony, fairly straightforward. We need to continue the urban fabric as much as we can. As architects, we need to continue the modes of operation of the city, for instance, both from a macro, meso, and of course a micro level as well. So some of the measurables include connectivity, placemaking, as well as a reduction of the UHI, or the urban heat island effect, in the context of a very sunny Singapore. Next slide. So an example again from way early on in my career. It's a public housing building. It looks not so harmonious yet, but at this point in time, the entire landscape has basically densified, and this becomes sort of part of the urban tapestry of, in this case, a public housing zone in Singapore, and introducing breathing lungs within the building through the voids, and also opportunities for chance encounters through some of these connections at regular intervals within the building. And just a bit of context, we don't talk to our neighbors in Singapore. We go home to our little pigeonholes, and with any luck, we'll be talking to them through Teams, through Zoom. Next slide. Health and well-being. So here's where we adopt the principles of biophilia, of comfort, of safety, and of generally creating pleasant environments, and designing gates and designing fairly social environments while keeping security in hand. So some of the metrics could be PMV, which is the predicted mean vote of what could be thermally and visually comfortable, for instance, and what sort of aspects would lead towards sort of psychological wellness as a result of interacting with natural elements within the building or without off the building. Next slide. All right, so same project again with access to greens at high levels, and we took some of these concepts. Next slide. So we took some of these concepts into a hospital or healthcare type of environment where every ward has access to a visual green at least, and for patients who are mobile, they get access to, they get physical access to some of these greens as well. And while preserving, I think, the lush greenness of the landscape, but we're also preserving, hopefully, the dignity of the patients, some of whom are actually in palliative care, meaning they're end-of-life patients. terminal diseases. But they too also have access to these greens and spa treatments along the foreground of this image, as you see. Next slide. And finally, designing for adaptability, and that's where buildings can become structures that will last for not just 30 years, as the real estate market would dictate in Singapore, or maybe even in Hong Kong or in Asia generally, but looking at buildings that can last for hundreds of years, and that's basically designing for future heritage. Next slide. And in this case, a project that connects two heritage buildings and repurposes these two buildings and opening up the interiors, and this being a furniture showroom with the glass building in the middle being the new insertion into the existing two conservation buildings. Next slide. Thereby opening up and accessing the two buildings on each side, flanking the new building, which is the main showroom area. Next slide. Another project here. I'm not saying this will be a future heritage type of project. This looks a bit dated now looking at it, but it was a building that takes an existing 10-story building and basically wraps a new layer, a new facade around it, and increases the building height by another 2 stories because of its robust structural design. Next slide. In doing so, creating a new veil and creating new types of spaces for the buildings, new types of purposes and technologies for the buildings as well. So not only does it become an industrial building that it once was, but also becomes a sales gallery for different brands and so on. Next slide. So in closing, in Singapore, we're thrown all sorts of things, not just global goals by the UN, but also on the bottom left, as you can see, the Singapore Green Plan, which was introduced last year with very specific and targeted goals for decarbonization towards 2030. I think it's about 2 decades ahead of global 2050 decarbonization goals. Not sure if we can meet them exactly by 2030, but plans are underway and they're being sort of aggressively pushed out by the authorities as well. Where it regards building, there's Green Mark 2021, which is a new set of guidelines, EE being energy efficiency, and then HW, health and wellness, resiliency, carbon accounting, maintainability, and intelligence. So these are 6 different aspects of how the green performance of buildings will be measured. Next slide. With the SIA guidelines, the environmental design guidelines, we've mapped them against the goals of the Green Plan as well as the requirements of Green Mark 2021. And the overlaps are where architects really do have great agency in influencing, I think, the green performance of buildings. And that's before you even start talking about chillers, before you start talking about building management systems and building controls. Next slide. All right, so wrapping up, here's a little project we did during COVID, and that's basically what a modular green type of building could be that encapsulates the 7 environmental design guidelines. So you see, of course, there'll be urban farms and the sort of food resiliency aspect on the top floor, right? Adaptable spaces that could become wards and research areas and work and play areas almost as we move towards a more endemic type of environment. And that too can become a sort of satellite facility for healthcare. Next slide. So yeah, not only do we need to survive this whole climate crisis, we also need to thrive in its midst. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Han. Really interesting and inspiring talk, and how important it is that we have these guidelines and goals to create a measurable framework, and really great to see how materials can be reused or recycled recreatively. And I love that PV table actually, and some really fantastic projects too. So thank you very much, Han. Our third speaker is Stefano Tranchi, Associate Principal and Regional Sustainability Lead for Woods Beckett in Hong Kong. Stefano is an architect with numerous years of professional experience in master planning, urban design, mixed use and civic architecture, and also interior design. He heads the Global Impact Group at Woods Bagot for the Asia region, leading the regional agenda on sustainability and wellness. His professional experience has enabled him to build a deep understanding of the Asian places, the challenges faced by cities developing in this region, and the expectations of an ever-changing population of future users. Trained in design thinking and creative collaboration techniques, he develops design from an initial understanding of a location user behavior, community values, and unique site opportunities, with health and well-being central to his ethos. So welcome, Stefano, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here tonight. Today, we are focusing on cities and the impact they have on climate change. Why do we focus on cities? We know that they are important in terms of our carbon emissions and the future of our environment. Cities actually have probably even more impact than what we assume. They contribute to approximately 75% of the global carbon emissions, and buildings, so what we architects design every day, contribute to 60% of that. So that somehow it's a little bit sobering data that puts into perspective on why we're talking about cities today. And it's even more important when we think about cities in future tense. Consider there are over 150 entirely new cities currently underway in more than 40 countries, and that's staggering. So we can barely manage the climate emissions of the cities that we have today. Imagine adding all of these ones in the very near future. And when you layer population and overpopulation and the impact it has on climate change, we can see important shifts also in terms of where the future cities are going to be located. In a few decades, we can progressively map the way people will transition from megacities that are currently located predominantly in the first world countries or well-developed countries to areas in the world that currently are described as more developing countries that are all the more impacted by the effect of climate change. So all of these things considered, we have to really focus on how we design cities for tomorrow, but also how we develop cities that we have today for a much better environmental and human perspective. So when we were putting together this presentation, we were not going to provide you with a magic wand and change everything right away, but rather focusing on a handful of characteristics of topics that can be implemented in our daily job in order to design and redesign cities for a better impact, from resiliency to regeneration to human-centric design and attention to resources. So starting with the first one, what does it mean designing climate resilient cities? We all know about the flooding issues that we have in this region, and very recently with the latest typhoon all over Southeast Asia and China. So prevention from flooding, prevention from environmental hazards, using nature-based solutions to reduce the impact of global warming, and also protecting human properties as well as infrastructure from damage so that they can have a longer life. For example, in China, we can see that the government and academics and professionals are already starting to implement changes of this sort. There is this, maybe more you would be familiar with the Sponge Cities initiative, which is something that Dr. Yu Konjang initially defined, and it's basically an approach to use natural infrastructure across different urban environments to decrease the impact of environmental hazards, and especially flooding and stormwater. And it's already had a significant valuable impact in many cities in China and can become a very good blueprint to follow for many other cities affected by tropical storms. And in Woods Bagot, we designed this workplace campus called MC Square in a completely different climate in Abu Dhabi. So here, the impact of climate change is exactly reverse. It's the desert and increased temperature and lack of water that impacted us more. And we needed to find a solution to how to create instead, despite the location and the climate, environments for people to enjoy and thrive, because only through that approach we can have successful business and successful environments and communities. So we designed this master plan interlaying an urban grid to what we call the climate grid that favors the direction of the wind and provides shades and collects water into pools in order to create the possibility of smaller gardens, all the more augmenting the urban comfort, the outdoor comfort of all of these spaces. When it comes to regenerative cities, we are thinking about infrastructure that can sequester and store carbon, mitigate climate change, create green urban infrastructure to reduce heat and energy demand, but also applicable to systems and resources resiliency, for example, food and supply chain. In terms of food, a good model that exists today, it's what Melbourne is putting together during the last couple of years. It's called a football city model. Basically, in a nutshell, it imagines a kilometer zero organic food supply system surrounding the whole city and being able to supply for the majority of the food needs and requirements of the city itself. And right in the middle of the dense urban environment, having a number of smaller urban farms that can have impact on their own neighborhood and communities. When we designed Funan as lead architects a few years ago in collaboration with an amazing team of consultants, and Andrew was one of them. He designed the urban farm on top of the rooftop, as I mentioned before. And as I mentioned, the impact of very well crafted and designed small patches of green and functional green to the city is enormous. For example, one thing that I learned just recently, this urban farm, which is managed by Edible Garden City, partially employs people with disability. So imagine even the social impact, not just the full resilience that something like that can have in the middle of one of the densest cities in Asia. So additionally, we want cities to be people-centric in the sense of putting people first, having a design approach that has in mind societal and climate justice for all, implemented at city level, not just small projects, thinking about accessibility, safety, diversity, and education widespread across the whole city, and using buildings to do so. When you start thinking about how cities change, the moment that they shift from being catered for cars towards people, the impact is enormous. Here you can see three simple examples of major cities in the world: New York, London, and Seoul. The moment that some of the more significant and photogenic destinations was changed from a road and car-driven environment to people-driven environment, the whole environment, the whole urban space changed completely to the benefit of the city itself. And in New York, like probably the High Line is one of the most amazing examples of how an approach to people-centric, regenerative cities can take form and shape by renovating an existing piece of abandoned infrastructure, crossing the whole city, and changing it into a place that all New Yorkers now want to go to in order to gather, meet friends and family, and also regenerating the local habitat and biodiversity that otherwise doesn't have that many possibilities to be regenerated. In Woodsbeggar, we designed this building, the National Australia Bank in Melbourne, a few years ago, with a similar approach, putting people at the very center. So we wanted to change the idea of a bank from an inaccessible tower to something that instead has an honest and transparent look and communicates with its own community, having a much better impact. So the building itself is a very, very sustainable building, but the most interesting factor is this giant atrium that sits at the very middle of it, completely open to the ground floor, the whole bank works around this atrium, and the ground floor is completely public. So people cross it all the time, moving from one side to the other of the city. And naturally, different facilities start happening in that floor where the bank can connect to its own community and solve problems and have people come up with ideas and establish that connection between businesses and society that is so essential to do change. Finally, when we talk about resourceful cities, we're talking about cities modeled around this idea of circular economy, a city and regional level, and having a very strong focus on resilience in terms of energy and water and all sorts of resources. And we know that our cities, especially in the West, they're designed for cars, as urban sprawls and suburbia have very little attention to maintaining its resources and preserving its resources. And even when we talk about circularity, which is a word that is starting to be used everywhere today, we forget sometimes how circularity is not something that applies exclusively to first world countries, has an impact across the whole world. So developing models for urban development that focus on not having any negative impact on third world countries, it's extremely important. So there is a level of social and climate justice applied to the systems that we use in order to develop our cities that is absolutely fundamental for the survival of this approach. In the world, we have a number of cities that have committed to carbon neutrality very soon, actually, in the next 20, 25, 30 years. And this is a list of the major ones, and Hong Kong and Singapore are there. Suffice to say that none of these cities is actually in line with their prediction and their targets. So they need to speed up their efforts in order to meet their commitments. When we designed this building is a design for a net zero tower in Hong Kong, part of the advancing net zero competition that happened across the whole Southeast Asia. So we wanted to embody the most amount of these principles. First of all, this is a renovation of an existing tower. We didn't want to propose a new building because the saying goes that the most sustainable building is the one that never got built. In 2050, buildings in Hong Kong will account for the 80% of the buildings in Hong Kong in 2050 has already been built. So we need to consider this existing building stock first. And then second, how do we densify it even further? Buildings are over designed in terms of structure. So we were thinking about, can we add a piece on top of the building, a few more floors in order to densify what we have and preserve the existing natural land around the city rather than compromising it any further. And then adding ways of course, getting to energy zero, as close as possible carbon zero, but when carbon zero, expanding the life of the building as much as possible. We imagined this building through a number of adjustments in time, being able to reach 100 years, almost 100 years of life, ending life in 2080. And finally, we called it Avatar in order to, because we imagine it to be a totem for change in terms of not just architecture, but also behavior. Behavioral change is essential in order to achieve the change that we require in our cities. So that's what we propose. So I'll close it here in a nutshell. I wanted to just close with one point. In order to achieve change and to face the challenge of climate change in our cities as architects, as professionals in this field, we absolutely need to find agencies and networks and platforms to be able to collaborate together honestly and openly amongst professionals, with governments, with construction companies and developers in order to really achieve the target that we have placed upon ourselves. So thank you very much for having me here, and I give the control back to Dennis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano, for your insights and some really amazing examples. And I really like these places that can be doing so many things to improve our environment, be it biodiversity, mobility, energy, resources, etc. And these are really true multifunctional places, what I call multifunctional. that are not only climatic responsive, but really give us some really unique experience too. So thank you, Stefano. Fiona, do we have time for some questions, answers?
Do we have time for some questions? Yes, I think we've got at least 7 minutes. Perhaps I'll start with one. I thought that last example you gave, Stefano, of the Avatar building in Hong Kong was interesting because it seemed to pleat a whole lot of different uses into one very small floor plate. I guess the issue that Singapore and Hong Kong have is a real lack of land area, and there are so many competing demands, whether it's urban farming, greening, replacement greening at whatever multiple, solar power to replace carbon usage and things. What are the feasible or best strategies? If we have a limited amount of land area, what should we use it for? What should we prioritize?
So when we're thinking about designing that building, we know that the dimensions of our cities, the sustainability of our cities, it's proportional to the amount of green and natural space that it surrounds it, partly for food production and resources, but also for as a green lung that it will allow us to support the city itself and make it more sustainable. So we should really focus on how to utilize the footprint of the urban environments that we have already, densifying it more and more, maybe, rather than coming up with new construction if possible. What we found out in our collaboration with our engineer partners, Burhapo, for that project was that particular building, that it's not even 30 years old, has a structure that could hold a lot more weight, and as many other buildings has a structure that is over-designed. So if the regulations will change and adjust in order to allow us to utilize the structures for the way that they are designed for, we may imagine densifying our cities, creating communities within the same buildings. So going and of course there are code and regulation shift that is required. But yeah, I think that the reflection starts from how to improve and redevelop the city that we already have before we start to deplete the natural environment that surrounds them.
Very good.
Question for Hann. Sorry, Dennis. I was just going to expand that into a question for Hann, because some of the examples you showed, Hann, were done at WOHA, and lots of WOHA's designs are actually replicating the ground plane. So we're making higher buildings and then we're connecting them at upper levels. How important do you think that is? Like when we have limited land, are we actually going underground and up into the air? And is that a potential solution to densification, as Stefano mentioned?
Yeah, well, I can't speak on behalf of WOHA, well, at least not anymore. But I think architecturally in general, there are quite a few benefits of actually living above the ground plane. And I think if you go back to the very sort of traditional vernacular types of dwelling, you've got ground floor housing, but they tend to be raised, and that does a couple of things that prevents wild animals from coming in, but it also removes you from the brunt of the reflected ground heat. And as a mode of thermal comfort, you could therefore do away with any sort of fans or air conditioning as a result of orientation and the fact that it was actually lifted off the ground. So now in the contemporary sense, if you're looking at, say, 50 stories or 100 stories above the ground, of course, the climate is cooler in some sense because you're away from the ground heat. And if you're at the same time replicating the sort of ecosystems that you otherwise find on the ground plane, then you're creating multiple levels and you're basically multiplying the land that you've got. So I think from a very sort of simple conceptual level, it's a way of expanding upon the land that we have. But then if you start working out, say, the carbon, the amount of energy it takes to pipe all that water up, the sort of maintenance that's required for the vegetation, and the potential pests that result as a consequence of this new ecosystem, then all of a sudden becomes a lot more expensive, right, and becomes a lot more inconvenient. So I think it really would be a combination of looking at these benefits and looking at some of these compromises, and at some point, some carbon accountant is going to put that into a figure and dollar sign. So go figure.
Thank you. Yeah, And maybe I have a question for Andrew. And I mean, Andrew and I actually worked together a long time ago on a number of projects. And when we started looking at those projects many years ago, I think we were addressing some of the issues that we are addressing now in terms of nature, biodiversity, landscape, greenery. But here we are, you know, we have a lot more problems to solve. I think we're getting a bit better at understanding how we design with nature. But Andrew, you know, in your opinion, you know, where do you think we will be in 20 to 30 years time? You know, how would you like to see, you know, what is the green scenery in 20 to 30 years time?
Yeah, I mean, so a dream, I guess, is to rethink how we think about cities and to not imagine cities about a series of buildings and heavy infrastructure, but to think about cities as amazing sort of landscapes and public experiences. Just to sort of reset how we imagine the starting point for a project or a city neighborhood. And I think, as I say, I mean, my presentation went around lots of sort of circles, but to a certain extent, I think it's a reset needed across all professions in terms of how we take forward, you know, future development thinking. And, you know, I mean, we've seen lots of really amazing projects from Stefano and Hann, and lots of them have green. and some of the most impressive ones were basically that people had started to address mobility and actually remove vast areas of highways and heavy sort of surfaces that deal with, you know, vehicles and give them back to people, cyclists, pedestrians, and space for nature, and how we create green connections through cities. So I see that as one of the biggest opportunities probably to start to sort of reshape, shift the identity, I guess, of places. I mean, some of the things I talk about in some of the other talks is about landscape cities, and reimagining places around landscape. So you think of Sydney, I think of Sydney as a landscape, not a city, not a built place. It's a landscape. Bath, where I live, is a landscape. And the more we can sort of shape the future cities around sort of landscape identities, I think that would be of great benefit.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Very good.
I think Gardens by the Bay is interesting. It is sort of isolated over there on a piece of synthetic land created for that purpose. I don't know if you've had any studies. The comparison pictures between 10 years ago and now are very interesting, how it's filled out. But I think it is having an effect beyond its own boundary, like the urban otters, which have become a symbol of Singapore now. I mean, they were not a thing 10 years ago. I've seen them over at Gardens by the Bay. I don't know if that's where they're kind of breeding. Hornbills have come back. It's like nature has taken over that part of Singapore and is gradually spreading out, connecting into the centre of the island as well. Was that expected, hoped for at the time?
It was definitely hoped for. I mean, so many aspects of the gardens were unexpected. You know, how it became a place that, you know, hundreds and millions of people, or not hundreds, but, you know, millions and millions of people wanted to go to see. You know, that was not necessarily it wanted to be an attraction, but it was designed around 3 or 4 million people a year, and it's more like 7 or 8 million pre-COVID. So huge success. I mean, the biodiversity aspect of it, I think, is really fascinating. The otters, great story, isn't it? But we were hoping for that sort of repopulation by interesting species, partially because of the density of the trees, but also the species. There's a whole load of species and habitat types which are really representative of Southeast Asia. And, you know, if it becomes an island, as there are many other islands in Singapore of this sort of natural regeneration, I think, you know, it's building blocks. The idea of a city in nature, I think, is inspirational as a sort of a reference point for other places, because once again, it just makes you think differently. It's not just about landscape as a sort of decorative, ornamental, making a nice place for people. It's scenic. It's about how do we create a sort of a balance between the human way of life and the sort of giving space for biodiversity.
Great.
We have got some questions in the Q&A. Dennis, let me just have a little look here. How about this one? Hong Kong and Singapore, always two cities to be compared in terms of landscape and greening. How do we see the Hong Kong's current positioning in contributing to the climate change and the landscape development, and what actions could help to expedite and escalate the process to let Hong Kong achieve as much as Singapore did? Perhaps one for you, Stefano, since you're there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. So I think that Hong Kong and Singapore are very similar in many ways, but there are some things that I think are specific to Hong Kong. Or at least I don't know exactly in relation to Singapore. One of the things that I'm seeing happening right now is that there are two major pools. One is the housing shortage of Hong Kong. Hong Kong's housing shortage is a major program for all of the latest political governments that have been in the city. It's something that has a very strong push that needs to be addressed. And usually it's seen as the development of certain areas that are currently undeveloped in a natural state in the city. At the same time, you have a very strong appeal towards net zero trajectory for the city, decarbonizing in 2050, also aligning to what China's blueprint is all about. So you have these two things that are a little bit contrasting. On one side, developing large parts of the territory, on the other side, wanting to preserve the natural aspect of the territory and making the city greener and greener. I don't really have a precise answer to how. I don't know exactly how this will develop in the future. What I can see is that the whole group of professionals that are tasked with developing the city and designing it for future generations, it's pretty much all aligned in trying to make it as greener and sustainable as possible, and also pushing the government to raise the bar of what is required for new buildings, for what's required for renovation of the buildings in terms of sustainability and performance. Hopefully, we're going to see more electric mobility happening in the city. Hopefully, we're going to see preservation of natural lands a lot more in the future.
A sort of sociological question. We can see democracy busily at work over in the UK today. Singapore and Hong Kong perhaps a little less so. Do we think there is, will we see in the future a kind of top-down model of sustainability being applied in our cities as the successful model, or a kind of grassroots upwelling of sentiment that finally gets us towards net zero? Anyone can answer.
I would just quickly follow up with what I was saying before, that I personally think that both of them are very important. Without the government pushing these resolutions, then laws and codes and regulations will not change. And that's the benchmark for the market to actually work in the terms of the market is working as today. But at the same time, the grassroots incredible engagement of new generations in terms of sustainability, human rights, and societal change, it's essential to have it in order to push the agenda for older generation that are running the show, and that need to develop a city that service the future ones coming up.
Yep. And I think one thing that is also important is the change of our behavior. I hope that when our cities evolve, we will be also changing our behavior, how we respond to the climate, how we want to live, how we want to reuse materials, how we want to eat, for example, things like that. So those are also important. I think a lot of developers these days, obviously, they have the environmental agenda, and they always talk about inclusive societies, but I actually think that the general public still need to be very much more aware of what we are trying to do or what our goals are, and then they can also adjust the lifestyles and the behavior at the same time.
I agree. Human factors are still something that need a lot of work. We can see that here in Singapore. Well, we're reaching 1940, which is the end of our webinar. So if I can just do a wrap up. Thank you, everyone. It's been great to hear your talks, your knowledge today coming from 3 very different parts of the world, but all really on the theme of integrating humanity back into nature, greening our cities and using that greenery as a way to improve sustainability and ensure a carbon neutral and sustainable future for humanity as part of the greater world. So thanks to Andrew, Hann and Stefano joining us from the UK, Singapore and Hong Kong. Thanks to the RIBA Hong Kong and Singapore chapters, and especially Chloe Sadler for facilitating the organisation. Thanks to our attendees as well. Continue to watch out for announcements of upcoming webinars on architecture.com and via Eventbrite. Thank you, everyone. And
Thank
we'll
you.
see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Bye-bye.